Morning sun barely peeked through the tall windows of courtroom 304 in the Philadelphia County Courthouse. It was 9:30 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning, and Judge Marcus Sterling adjusted his black robe as he prepared for another day of cases. At 62 years old with gray hair and tired eyes, he had spent 25 years on the bench, believing he had seen it all. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activities. Low clerks rushed through the marble hallways with stacks of papers, while lawyers in expensive suits whispered to their clients. The wooden benches in the courtroom were full of people waiting for their cases to be called. Sarah Chun is Judge Sterling's clerk for the last 3 years. She organized the day's files on his desk. As she reached a certain case, she hesitated and frowned slightly as she noticed something. But before she could mention it, Judge Sterling waved her off. "Let's get started," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had cultivated over decades. The first few cases moved swiftly, typical morning matters of traffic violations and minor offenses. Judge Sterling dispatched them with mechanical efficiency, not raising his eyes from the papers in front of him. He enjoyed a reputation throughout the Philadelphia legal community for being strict, particularly with some defendants, but no one dared bring up the subject aloud. At 10:45 a.m., Sarah called the next. Docket number 2024, County Route 789, Commonwealth versus Dr. Maya Washington. A woman stood from the back of the courtroom. Dr. Maya Washington walked forward with quiet dignity, her steps measured and calm. She wore a navy blue business suit. Her natural hair was neatly styled and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had been used to high-pressure situations. At 42 years old, she had this sort of presence that usually was supposed to command respect in whatever room she came into. But Judge Sterling barely looked up. He shuffled through the papers, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. The charge was a traffic violation that had escalated after a series of unfortunate events. A missed court date due to an emergency surgery she had to perform, followed by a misunderstanding with a police officer. "Your Honor," began Thomas Reed, Dr. Washington's attorney, "my client is a respected neurosurgeon at Philadelphia General Hospital. The McCourt date was due to an emergency operation that couldn't wait. We have documentation." Judge Sterling cut him off with a wave of his hand. "The facts are quite simple, Counselor. Your client failed to appear for a court date and then argued with an officer of the law when he attempted to serve the bench warrant." Dr. Washington stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She had spent the last 18 hours performing back-to-back brain surgeries, saving both patients' lives before coming directly to court. Dark circles under her eyes told the tale of her exhaustion, but her voice was steady. "Your Honor, if I may explain," she began, but Judge Sterling's sharp glance cut her off. "The time for explanations was at your original court date, Ms. Washington." He said it with inflection on the Ms. and without using her professional title. The corner of his mouth quivered downward as he looked again at the file in front of him. Several lawyers who had finished their own cases remained behind in the gallery to witness. They exchanged knowing looks. Anyone who spent time in Judge Sterling's courtroom knew his patterns. Sa Tien shifted uncomfortably a hair desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. She had noticed something in Dr. Washington's file, something important, but with the judge's dismissive attitude, she found herself hesitating to pipe up now. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Judge Sterling got into his lecture. "This court's time is valuable, Miss Washington. Your disregard for the law and subsequent behavior toward law enforcement shows a pattern of disrespect for our legal system." Dr. Washington remained stoic, but her attorney was looking more and more alarmed. A disputed right turn on a yellow light somehow had snowballed into so much more. Sarah finally found the courage to stop fidgeting and start writing a note. She knew what was coming next. She had seen it too many times before. But something was different this time. This time she knew something the judge didn't. As Judge Sterling prepared to announce his sentence, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds outside. Long shadows extended across the courtroom floor. And no one in that room, least of all Judge Sterling, was in himself cognizant that the next few moments were about to change everything. Judge Sterling cleared his throat as he leaned forward in his high-back chair. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 304 buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows across his stern face. Dr. Maya Washington stood perfectly still, her exhaustion from 18 hours of surgery masked by her professional dignity. "Miss Washington," Judge Sterling began, again deliberately ignoring her title. "This court cannot function when individuals choose to disregard its authority." His voice carried through the now silent courtroom, where even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. Sarah Chen's hand trembled slightly as she scribbled her note. She knew she had to act fast, but years of courtroom protocol made her hesitate. Interrupting a judge during sentencing was almost unheard of. "Your original violation was minor," Judge Sterling continued, his tone growing harder with each word, "but your subsequent actions show a disturbing disregard for law enforcement and this court." He paused, looking down at Dr. Washington over his reading glasses. The gallery had grown unusually full. The word had spread through the courthouse about what was happening in courtroom 304, and several lawyers and court staff found reasons to linger. They'd seen this pattern before, what started as a simple traffic ticket turning into something much more serious. Thomas Reed, Dr. Washington's attorney, stood up quickly. "Your Honor, if we could submit evidence of the emergency surgery that caused Counselor." Judge Sterling cut him off sharply. "You've had your chance to speak. The time for explanations has passed." His fingers drummed against his desk, a habit he displayed when his patients wore thin. Dr. Washington's shoulders remained straight, but her fingers tightened around each other. In her mind, she saw the faces of the two patients she'd saved last night, a teenage boy with a brain tumor and an elderly woman with a hemorrhage. Both would have died if she hadn't missed that court date. "This court sentences you to 30 days in county jail," Judge Sterling announced, causing a collective gasp from the gallery, plus a fine of $5,000. "Your Honor." Sarah Chen's voice cut through the courtroom like a thunderbolt. In her 15 years as a court clerk, she had never interrupted a judge. Her hands shaking, she scurried forward with her note, almost tripping over her sensible shoes. Judge Sterling turned to her, his face flushing red at the interruption. "Miss Chen, what is the meaning of?" But Sarah had already laid the note in front of him. Her usual neat handwriting was hurried and urgent. "Dr. Maya Washington, chief of neurosurgery at Philadelphia General, saved Emma's life last October. Your granddaughter's emergency surgery." The color drained out of Judge Sterling's face as he read the note. His hands, so steady, began to shake a little. He looked up at Dr. Washington, really seeing her for the first time that morning. Memories flooded back. His 16-year-old granddaughter Emma, the terrifying phone call about her collapse at soccer practice, the desperate hours in the hospital waiting room. You remembered a surgeon who had walked out at 3 a.m. still in her scrubs to tell them Emma would make a full recovery, the same surgeon who now stood before him in his courtroom. "Dr. Washington," he said softly, her proper title finally finding its way to his lips. The change in his tone made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly. Dr. Washington met his gaze steadily. "Yes, Your Honor. I remember Emma well. She had an arteriovenous malformation, a type of brain bleed. She's doing very well in her follow-up appointments." The silence in the courtroom grew thick. The hands of Judge Sterling went to pull off his reading glasses to reveal eyes that suddenly appeared older, more distressed, as the familiar walls of his prejudices cracked, letting in uncomfortable rays of truth. Sarah Chen stepped back to her desk. Her heart was pounding. In the gallery, the lawyers watching exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew they were beholding one of those moments when justice, true justice, hung in the air. Judge Sterling looked down at his sentencing notes, then back at Dr. Washington. His next words would acknowledge either his mistake or his prejudice. The weight of the moment weighed upon all of them in courtroom 304 as heavy as the morning air before a storm. For 30 very long seconds, Judge Sterling sat completely still in his chair, his face contorted in a mixture of shock and realization. The only sound in courtroom 304 was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the far-off echo of footsteps in the hall outside. He remembered that terrible night at Philadelphia General Hospital, as though it had been yesterday. Dear Emma, his granddaughter, lying white and unconscious upon the hospital bed. And the doctors explaining were saying something about an emergency surgery of the brain. The endless waiting, praying, and hoping. And then Dr. Washington coming out from the operation room at 3 a.m., still dressed in her surgical scrubs, informing them Emma was going to live, Your Honor. Thomas Reed's voice delicately broke into the judge's ruminations. "Perhaps we could take a brief recess." Judge Sterling's throat cleared, his hands clenching on the edge of the desk. Yes, a 15-minute recess. His voice now was odd, softer, less sure. Dr. Washington, please remain in the courtroom. With the gallery emptying, whispers filled the air. The court officers stood uncomfortable by the doors, sensing that something out of the ordinary hung in the air. Sarah Chun buzzed herself, arranging papers, though her eyes kept darting between the judge and Dr. Washington. Once the courtroom was mostly empty, Judge Sterling stood up. He no longer looked like the stern, unyielding figure from just minutes ago. Instead, he seemed older, more human, more vulnerable. Dr. Washington. He began stepping down from the bench. I owe you an apology, not just for today, but he paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. Would you join me? In my chambers, your attorney is welcome to accompany us. In the judge's chambers, the morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, creating stripes of sunshine across the dark wooden desk. Family photos lined the shelves, including one of Emma at her recent soccer championship ship, alive and smiling because of the woman standing before him. Dr. Washington sat down, her posture still professional but slightly more relaxed. The exhaustion from her long night of surgeries was more visible now in the natural light. Emma showed me her trophy last month during her final checkup, she said softly, nodding toward the soccer photo. She's made a remarkable recovery, Judge. Sterling reached out for the photo, her fingers still trembling. I wouldn't be alive without you. He laid the frame down and locked eyes with Dr. Washington. And this morning, without taking the time to even look at you, that I was ready to send you to jail. Thomas Reed sat quietly, mesmerized by what was unfolding before him. In his 20 years of practicing law, he had never quite witnessed anything like this. Your Honor, Dr. Washington ventured carefully, what happened this morning is not about me alone. It's about every person who comes into your courtroom. The judge slumped back into his chair, the weight of her words hitting him hard. How many others had he judged unfairly? How many times had he let his prejudices blind him to the human beings standing before him? Last night, Dr. Washington continued, I performed 2 emergency surgeries. One was on a 17-year-old boy named Marcus. The other was on a grandmother named Ruth. Both are alive this morning. That's why I missed my original court date 3 months ago. I was saving another life. Judge Sterling looked at the medical documentation on his desk that he had earlier refused to flip to the next page. A narrative of lives spared, families remaining intact, because Dr. Washington put her patients first. Sarah Chun lightly knocked and entered with a stack of files. Your Honor, I took the liberty of pulling some of your recent cases. There's a pattern you might want to see. The judge nodded, starting to grasp the whole dimension of this moment. His decision hadn't just changed Dr. Washington's life. It has touched a multitude of lives over these years on the bench. Now the morning sun was finally up, filling the chamber with a clarity of light. Unforgiving light at that brightness. Judge Sterling could no longer hide from himself and his actions. The question was, what would he do with this revelation? Dr. Washington watched him closely, seeing the internal struggle play across his face. This moment could either be a real turning point or just another missed opportunity for change. The next few minutes would tell which path Judge Sterling would choose. That evening, Judge Marcus Sterling couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, surrounded by law books and case files, lit up the room with just a desk lamp on. The wall clock was pointed at 11:45 p.m., but his mind kept whizzing back to the morning's events. In courtroom 304, on his desk lay 2 photographs. The first showed his granddaughter Emma scoring a goal in her recent soccer match, something that would never have happened if Dr. Washington hadn't saved her life. The second was a copy of Dr. Washington's medical credentials that Sarah Chun had printed for him. Decades of education, countless lives saved, and numerous awards for her work in poor communities. Marcus, are you coming to bed? His wife Linda appeared in the doorway, wearing her blue robe. She knew that look on her husband's face when his world had been shaken. I almost sent her to jail, Linda, he said quietly, still staring at the photos. The same doctor who saved Emma's life. I didn't even look at her properly. I just saw. His voice trailed off, unable to finish the painful truth. Linda walked into the office and sat across from him. Tell me what happened, she said gently. So he did, starting with the morning's court session and ending with his shameful realization. Meanwhile, across town in Philadelphia General Hospital, Dr. Maya Washington was finishing another late shift. She stood at the nurse's station, updating patient charts, her mind occasionally drifting to that morning's events in court. Dr. Washington, a young resident, approached her. "The family of Marcus Thompson, your surgery patient from last night, they wanted you to have this," he said, handing her a hand-drawn card covered in colorful crayon drawings. Opening it, she found a picture of herself drawn by beneath it, in letters that shook just a little, was scrawled, "Thank you for saving my Bach brother." The naive words welled tears into her eyes, reminding her why she had chosen this path despite all the obstacles. Back in his office, Judge Sterling began to pull files from his past cases. The words of Sarah Chun haunted him about patterns. He started to make notes, making 2 columns on a legal pad. Evidence mounted, and it was making him sick to his stomach. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Grandpa, Mom told me what happened today. W is amazing, isn't she? She checks on me every time I have a follow-up. She even came to my soccer game last month." The judge's hands shook as he read the message. He remembered Dr. Washington's words from that morning. "What happened today is about more than just me in her hospital office." Dr. Washington finally sat down after her shift. A news alert popped up on her computer. Another story about bias in the justice system. She thought about Judge Sterling's face when he finally recognized her. The moment when his carefully built walls began to crack. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph of her graduation day from medical school. She was the only black woman in her class. Her mother had told her that day, "Baby, you're not just becoming a doctor, you're becoming a mirror that shows people their own prejudices." At midnight, Judge Sterling was still awake. He walked to his kitchen for water and found Linda waiting with 2 cups of tea. "Remember what my father used to say?" Linda asked, sliding a cup toward him. "The hardest person to judge fairly is yourself." The judge nodded, warming his hands around the cup. "I've spent 25 years on the bench, Linda. How many lives have I affected? How many Dr. Washingtons have stood before me, and I never saw them for who they really were in the quiet of that late hour." Both Judge Sterling and Dr. Washington, in their separate places, were thinking about change. The judge opened his laptop and began typing a letter to the State Judicial Review Board. Dr. Washington finished her patient notes and added one more thing to her schedule: a lecture on bias in healthcare and justice systems that she had been invited to give. The night grew deeper, but for both of them, something new was beginning. Sometimes it takes a mirror to show us who we really are, and sometimes that mirror comes in the form of a person we almost wronged. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a new day, and both the judge and the doctor would face their own reflections again. But now they were both a little more aware of the weight their actions carried and of the power they had to create change. 1 week after the incident in the courtroom, Judge Sterling sat in his office, surrounded by towers of case files. His death calendar showed 7:30 a.m., but he had been there since dawn. Sarah Chun stood nearby, adding another stack of folders to the already crowded space. "That's the last 5 years of cases, Your Honor," Sarah said, pointing to the colored tabs she had organized. Red for harsh sentences, yellow for moderate, and green for lenient ones. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The red tabs appeared much more frequently on files of minority defendants. Judge Sterling picked up one of the red-tagged files. "James Carter, African-American, 19 years old, first offense, shoplifting. I gave him 6 months." His voice grew heavy. "Next case, that same day, Michael Brooks, white, 20 years old, same charge, same circumstances, 3 months probation." Teasingly, Sarah watched her boss, who was once so certain of his judgments, question every decision. The proud man who never admitted he ever made mistakes was gone, replaced by someone determined to face uncomfortable truths. Across town, Dr. Washington was giving her morning rounds at Philadelphia General Hospital when her phone buzzed. There was an email from the State Judicial Review Board requesting her presence at a hearing. Judge Sterling had reported himself for bias in sentencing and listed her case as evidence. "Everything okay?" He drive W asked Jenny, her favorite nurse, noticing her surprised expression. "Yes," Dr. Washington replied, still staring at her phone. "Just unexpected news. Sometimes people can surprise you in good ways." Back in his chambers, Judge Sterling met with Judge Maria Rodriguez, a respected colleague known for her fair sentencing. She sat across from him, reviewing his revelations. "Marcus," she said, looking up from the papers, "what you're doing is brave, but it's also going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Some of your colleagues want thank you for shining this light on the system." Sterling nodded, remembering how he used to dismiss concerns about bias in the courts. Maria, I've been wrong for so long. Last week, I almost sent a brilliant surgeon to jail because I couldn't see beyond my own prejudice. How many others have I read throughout the day? He met other judges, legal scholars, and civil rights lawyers. Each meeting was more difficult than the last, but he didn't avoid the tough conversations. Meanwhile, Dr. Washington received yet another surprise call. The local bar association wanted her to speak at their annual conference about her experience. She sat in her office thinking about the request. I'm a surgeon, not a public speaker, she told her colleague Dr. James Chin over lunch. Maybe that's precisely why you should do it, Dr. Chin said. You can help them put a face to the defendant's table. Back in the courthouse, Sarah Chun brought Judge Sterling his afternoon coffee and found him reviewing video recordings of his past court sessions. The recording showed a pattern he had never noticed before. His different tones of voice, his body language, rushed judgments. Your Honor, Sarah said carefully, Channel 7 News has been calling. They've heard about yourself, Rue, and want to do a story. Sterling shook his head. This isn't about publicity, Sarah. It's about fixing what I broke. He picked up another file. Look at this one, Sandra Thompson. Denny bail for a minor offense, single mother. Lost her job because of my decision. As the day wore on, more files revealed more patterns. In each case, Judge Sterling made a note where his bias might have clouded his judgment. The list grew longer, but he didn't stop. Each name meant a person whose life he had touched one way or another. In the evening, his office resembled a war room, with files spread everywhere and colored sticky notes covering his walls. Sarah had stayed late to help, feeling part of something important. We need to review at least 10 years of cases, he said, rubbing his tired eyes, and then Sarah asked, and then we start making things right. He replied, picking up his phone to make another call to the review board. Outside his window, the sunset painted Philadelphia's skyline in shades of orange and purple. In her hospital office, Dr. Washington was finishing her day's work when she decided to accept the Bar Association's invitation. Change, she realized, happened one conversation at a time. The Philadelphia County Courthouse's largest meeting room was packed. Judge Sterling standing at the podium in front of more than 200 people, former defendants, lawyers, community leaders, and fellow judges. He felt the morning sun streaming through the tall windows, illuminating nervous sweat on his forehead. My name is Marcus Sterling, he began, his voice trembling slightly. For 25 years, I've served as a judge in this courthouse, and for 25 years, I've been part of the problem. He paused, gazing out at the faces in front of him. Today, that changes. In the front row, Dr. Maya Washington sat next to Sarah Chun. They watched as the judge who once ruled his courtroom, once stiff with authority, was now bent in humility towards the community he had harmed. We've examined more than 3,000 of my P cases, Sterling resumed, nodding towards the screen behind him displaying statistics. It's obvious. I have no excuse. The proof of my racism is obvious and undeniable. African-American defendants sentenced to an average of 40% more time than white defendants for the same crimes. Latino defendants were asked for higher bail amounts. Asian Americans were denied interpreters more frequently. Murmurs swept throughout the crowd. Some nodded in recognition of their experiences. Others looked shocked at the numbers. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Sterling said, his voice growing stronger. Behind each case is a person whose life I affected. James Carter lost his scholarship because of my harsh sentence. Maria Gonzalez's children went into foster care because I denied her bail. David Chin's restaurant closed when I refused to consider his family circumstances. In the audience, some wiped away tears. Others sat straight-backed, their faces showing years of stored pain. I cannot undo the past. Sterling added, but I can work to make it right. He gestured to a team of lawyers sitting at a side table. Starting today, we're launching the Sterling Review Initiative. Every case where my bias affected the outcome will be reviewed. We have partnered with the Public Defender Office and private law firms who will work pro bono to help overturn unjust sentences. Dr. Washington watched as some audience members hew each other. She remembered her own morning in his courtroom, how close she had come to joining the list of lives disrupted by prejudice. The judge continued. We've also set up a reparations fund. I'm selling my vacation home, and I'm putting in my own savings. It won't make everything right, but it's a start. Sarah Chin rose and headed towards the podium with more files. These had green stickers, cases already identified to be taken under review right away. The work had long since begun. But the most important change, Sterling said, addressing his fellow judges, has to be the way that we go forward. I am working with the Judicial Review Board to create new rules for bias checks and sentencing. Every judge would have to go over his own patterns twice a year. Some of his colleagues squirmed in their seats. Change wasn't easy, especially for those accustomed to being beyond question. Following the presentation, a line formed to speak with Judge Sterling. Each had a story, a case, a memory. He listened to all, jotting down names, case numbers, details. No more rushing through lives as if those people were merely numbers on a docket. Dr. Washington approached him last. That couldn't have been easy. That couldn't have been easy, she said. Extending her hand, Sterling shook it, remembering how differently he had treated her. Just weeks ago, the easy path led me wrong for 25 years, doctor. It's time for the harder road. Later that afternoon, news crews gathered outside the courthouse. The story was spreading, a judge admitting bias, working to make amends, challenging the system itself. Some called it career suicide, others called it a watershed moment in his chambers. Judge Sterling met with the first group of lawyers who would review his old cases. The work ahead was enormous, but for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly serving justice. Dr. Washington returned to her hospital, where she found a message waiting. Other courts in other cities wanted to know more about the Sterling initiative. Change, like a pebble thrown in water, was creating ripples. That evening, as the courthouse emptied, Sarah Chun found Judge Sterling still at his desk, reviewing more files. On his wall hung a new sign written in clear letters: Justice is not just what we do, but how we do it. The real work was just beginning. 3 months after Judge Sterling's public admission, the Philadelphia Judicial Center's main auditorium was filled to capacity. Dr. Maya Washington stood at the podium, facing an audience of judges, lawyers, and medical professionals from across the country. Medicine and justice have something important in common. She began, her voice clear and confident. In both fields, our biases can mean the difference between life and death, freedom or imprisonment. In the front row, Judge Sterling sat with Sarah Chun, both taking the conference entitled Breaking Bias. Healthcare and Justice was the first of its kind in bringing professionals from both worlds to address systemic PR. 6 months ago, I was almost sent to jail for a traffic violation. As Dr. Washington continued to show a slide of her operating room on the same day that she had saved 2 lives through emergency surgery in that courtroom, none of that mattered. I wasn't Dr. Washington, the neurosurgeon, just another face that fit someone's prejudice expectations. The audience shifted, and uncomfortably many recognized their biases in her words. At the back of the room, Emma, Judge Sterling's granddaughter, sat with her parents, now fully recovered from her brain surgery. Watched the doctor who had saved her life teach another kind of healing the system itself. But this story isn't about one judge or one doctor, Dr. Washington said. It's about the choices we make every day in the ER. I can't choose which patients deserve care based on how they look, and in a courtroom, justice must be equally blind. Click to the next slide, showing the results of the Sterling Initiative's first 3 months. 157 cases reviewed, 89 sentences reduced or overturned, $1.2 million in compensation distributed, and 23 other judges voluntarily joining the review process. Judge Sterling stood up next, joining Dr. Washington at the podium. The man who used to command his courtroom with an iron fist of authority now spoke with humility. We found something powerful, he said. When we show that we can admit when we're wrong and work to make it right, people start trusting the system. Over the past 3 months, court appearances have increased. People believe that they may actually receive a fair hearing. Sarah Chun presented the next section of how they had modified the day-to-day functioning of the court. Every judge had a bias check system in place now. Case reviews were monthly instead of yearly. Public defenders received more resources. Lunch break, Dr. Washington walked down the corridors of the hospital along with Judge Sterling as they stopped outside the pediatric ward where some of her small patients were recovering. Remember what you told me that day in your chamber? She asked about not being able to undo the past. Sterling nodded, watching a child in a wheelchair practice walking with a physical therapist in medicine. She continued, we can't undo damage either, but we can help heal. We can help people move forward. That's what you're doing with the initiative. Back at the conference afternoon session focused on practical changes, other courts shared their plans to adopt similar programs. Medical schools discussed new training to address bias in healthcare. Law schools presented updated curricula. Emma joined them for the last panel, sharing her experience from both sides as a patient protected by Dr. Washington and as the granddaughter of a judge that had learned to change. My grandfather taught me that being strong was admitting when you are wrong, she had informed the audience. Dr. Washington showed me every person deserves to be seen for whom they actually are. The day closing, Dr. Washington learned 5 more cities were asking for information about starting their very own bias review programs. Judge Sterling discovered more judges volunteering, and Judge Sterling was heading out. Dr. Washington hurried to catch up. We're making progress, she said, but there's still so much work to do. Yes, he agreed, but now we're doing it together. Doctors, judges, lawyers, communities, all of us learning to see each other clearly. They looked up at the hospital building where lights glowed in patient rooms, and then at the courthouse next door where late-working lawyers still moved through lit offices. 2 places of power, of life-changing decisions, slowly learning to serve everyone equally. The next day would bring more cases, more surgeries, more chances to either perpetuate bias or fight it. But now there was a path forward, and they weren't walking it alone. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in courtroom 304. The National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. was packed with over 1,000 attendees. Judge Marcus Sterling and Dr. Maya Washington stood together backstage, preparing for their keynote speech. Nervous, Dr. Washington asked, noticing Judge Sterling adjusting his third-time tie. A little, he admitted, a year ago, I was just a judge who thought he knew everything. Now I'm speaking to judges from all 50 states about everything I got wrong. Through the curtain, they could see Emma sitting in the front row. Now 17, she had become an active speaker at high schools about bias and justice. Next to her sat Sarah Chun, recently promoted to Chief Court Administrator. Her new position was created specifically to oversee bias prevention programs. The conference host approached the podium. Today's speakers need no introduction. Their story has mobilized change in courts coast to coast. Please welcome Judge Marcus Sterling and Dr. Maya Washington. As they took the stage, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Behind them on screens, numbers told their story. 1,247 cases reviewed and corrected. 37 states adopting similar programs. $5 million in compensation distributed. 89% reduction in sentencing disparities in participating courts. 1 year ago, Drive Washington began. I stood in a courtroom facing jail time. Today, I stand before you as a partner in change. She looked at Judge Sterling, but this isn't just about 2 people. It's about all the lives touched by bias and all the lives now being touched by reform. Judge Sterling stepped forward. The hardest moment in any judge's life, he said, is admitting we've been wrong, but the most important moment is deciding to make it right. They showed videos from around the country. A young man graduating college after his wrongful conviction was overturned. A grandmother opening a new business with her compensation funds. Judges and doctors collaborating to combat bias in both professions. In the midst of their presentation, breaking news flashed on everyone's phones. The Supreme Court had just announced new national guidelines for bias review in all federal courts based on the Sterling Initiative. Sarah Chun hurried backstage and handed them the news release. Dr. and then rinsed. Washington read it aloud to the audience, her voice shaking with passion. The justice system needs to reflect the reality that every human life matters and therefore has a right to be seen, to be heard, and to be judged in just manner. Workshop sessions followed the keynote. Judges sharing the realities of implementing reform. Public defenders talking of increased resourcing. Medical professionals sharing similar stories from healthcare. At lunchtime, Emma joined them at their table. Grandpa, she said, taking out her phone, my story about you and Dr. Washington won some national high school essay contest. They wished to publish it within the law journals. Judge Sterling hugged his granddaughter, remembering just how close he had come to losing her and just how his prejudice had almost made him hurt the very person who later saved her. Later that afternoon, Dr. Washington led a session on emergency room bias and surgery. We cannot choose our patients, she explained. In justice, you can't choose who deserves fair treatment. Everyone deserves the same care, the same justice, the same respect. As the conference came to a close, Judge Sterling was surprised with an honor. The National Judicial College would create a new annual award, the Sterling/Washington Prize for Judicial Reform, to honor judges whose work aimed to eradicate bias in their courts. "This isn't an award for me," he said in the ceremony. "It's for every soul who stood in my courtroom and didn't get the justice they deserved. It's for every judge willing to stare in the mirror and change. It's for every Dr. Washington who persists despite the barriers we put in their way." That evening, as they left the conference center, they saw a group of young law students waiting to talk to them, the next generation of judges and lawyers eager to learn from their story. "Do you ever regret that morning in court?" one student asked Dr. Washington. She looked at Judge Sterling, then at Emma, then back at the student. "That morning showed us that change is possible when we see each other clearly, when we admit our mistakes, when we work to make things right. That's when justice becomes real." As they walked into the Washington evening, they passed the Supreme Court, its phrase chiseled in granite. Equal justice under law, but something else now. Something more profound, truer, and human than ever before. Of course, the story was not over. But now it was everybody's, for those who would look in the mirror and choose to change.